Welcome to this Killick Explains video. This time around I want to take on an important save as you earn scheme, as they're called, explain why they often make sense and point out one or two things to watch out for and to think about before you join. So what's the background to this topic? Well, basically save as you earn, SAYE schemes, are offered by a number of employers. Not all employers offer them, so yours may or may not, but they're certainly worth finding out about and giving some consideration to. They create the chance basically to acquire shares cheaply and tax efficiently, provided the scheme is HMRC approved, as it's known. And that's the main benefit, the opportunity to become a shareholder in the company that employs you at a competitive price. But there are a few things to watch out for. So these are essentially a good idea in the main, but do watch out for a few considerations I'll come back to. So what are the basics of these schemes? Well, as I mentioned, they're offered by employers to employees and they give them the chance to save money, that's a good objective, and potentially share in their firm's future. So align your interests and the company's is the idea. And they do this via the opportunity to buy shares at a competitive price, because you might be thinking, well, if I like my employer, I could surely, subject to personal account dealing rules and so on, just go out and buy the shares on the open market. But actually this gives you the chance to buy them a bit cheaper, and that's what we'll come back to in a moment. And later you've got some choices. Basically you can sell the shares once you acquire them, or you can keep them, but we'll look at one or two of the considerations in a moment. So the basic deal is what? Well, let's say an employee chooses to save up to £500 per month into the scheme. Now that's the cap. You don't have to save all of that. It's important to think about how much you're going to save, because once you start, the scheme rules essentially require you to keep going to get the maximum benefit. This amount usually earns interest and often a bonus. The timing of that bonus payment will vary, but it might be at the end, for example, a sort of loyalty bonus. And after a minimum period of 3 or 5 years, depending on your employer, an employee then has a choice, provided contributions were maintained. So really important to think about what you can afford up front, because you should aim to maintain those monthly contributions throughout the life of the scheme. Now, choices. Let's say you've done that. What are your choices once the scheme matures? You could take out your cash plus any interest and any tax-free bonus. But that wouldn't be the main point of being in this scheme. What you hope to do is use the funds to buy company shares at a price fixed at the start, in the hope that subsequently they've risen. And I'll go through a very simple example of that in a moment. If the option to buy shares is exercised, the shares can then be kept, transferred or sold. And there are a few things to think about in that context. Now, a rising share price, just to illustrate the real basic mechanics here. What would that look like? So you've accrued a total of £10,000 in a save as you earn scheme. That is a mixture of your contributions on a monthly basis, any interest that's been added on top, and any bonus on top of that. Let's say the company's share price when you entered the scheme was £2, but after 3 years, this is a 3-year scheme, it's risen to £3. Good news. So the company's done well. How does that help you? Well, you could now buy 5,000 shares, that's the original £10,000 I mentioned divided by 2, the share price when you entered the scheme, and they'll now be worth £15,000, the current market price. So there's a gain of £5,000 locked in there potentially for you. Now, the share price might fall, the company might not do too well, and that's something to bear in mind. Share prices go down as well as up, so you've accrued the same £10,000 in this scheme, your contributions, interest and any bonus. On entry the company share price was £4, but sadly after 3 years it's dropped to 2. Now what would you do? Well, you could take out the £10,000 in cash tax free, so your downside is limited in that sense, but that's obviously not as good as an option to exercise and buy shares. Unfortunately in this instance there's no point in doing that. Now, what happens to shares that you've bought? So let's say things have gone well. I mean, no one goes into these schemes thinking things will go badly, one hopes. So things have gone well. What are your choices next? You could keep the shares. You could sell them for an immediate, potentially taxable gain. Bear in mind that capital gains tax will kick in potentially, but there are allowances. There are ways to reduce CGT, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Or you could move them, that's the shares, into an ISA or SIP, so another tax-effective wrapper, within 90 days, in which case all gains are tax-free, but you do need to make your mind up reasonably quickly if you want to take that route. Now, key considerations. So how do you sort of think about this and what's the best course of action? Well, if you keep the shares, things to think about. They may subsequently fall in value. Shares go down as well as up. You are tied to your employer's fortunes in that sense. There's also a risk of overconcentration. People might build up quite a decent shareholding in their employer through one of these schemes and not realise that actually that's made their overall investment portfolio over-concentrated, overly dependent on one company, one employer. And if you don't, for example, take that 90-day option to move the shares into another tax-effective vehicle, you risk CGT complications. Now, that said, there are ways to reduce capital gains tax, so this video isn't primarily about that tax, but let's take a quick look at those. You can transfer some shares to a spouse, that's always true, to effectively double the annual CGT allowance. You could sell a proportion each tax year up to your CGT annual allowance, because it works on a use it or lose it basis, essentially. Or remember, there is that option to transfer into an ISA or a SIP, subject to limits and so on for those schemes and subject to you meeting that 90-day deadline. Now, that's quite a big topic. Save as you earn schemes are basically a good idea. I've pointed out one or two of the pitfalls. So any questions around that, editor@killick.com. And if you'd like to explore some of the other topics I mentioned there, ISAs and SIPs, for example, it's killick.com/learn and the tax effective savings tab.